Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and I'm coming to you. I'm Yves Engler. I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And I think we're up to like the 70 some odd Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, which is a weekly kind of show about Canadian foreign policy that takes different formats. Sometimes there's guests, sometimes like this evening, it's just me speaking, and then people can comment and question and criticize or whatever at the end. So I'll get right to things, because there was another pretty busy week in Canadian foreign policy. First of all, there's more protests in Peru on the Independence Day. There's this Take Lima that began about 10 days ago, where protesters from all across the country have gone to the capital to call for Dina Boluarte to leave, and for Pedro Castillo to be released from prison. Of course, there was a Canadian-backed ouster of the elected president back in December. The Canadian government has continued to support Boluarte and the repression, even though there's a 80% of Peruvians say they want early elections, which as of now are not scheduled until 2026. And 75% are saying they want Boluarte to resign. I published a piece titled "Democracy versus Repression. Guess what Ottawa supports in Peru?" And clearly they are backing the repressive usurper government. Last Monday, Canadian Foreign Policy Hour activist Laurel Thompson and myself, we interrupted Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault's announcement here in Montreal. It was actually on the National later on CBC that night. They had a Laurel with a sign next to the minister, and they had me on saying, "The world is on fire, shut the tar sands down or resign." And actually the climate coalition with all the big green groups, Suzuki Foundation, Greenpeace, etc., they actually referenced the disruption in their press release about Guilbeault's announcement, which is obviously all good. I also had people like a person stop me in the street who I sort of vaguely knew, and say he saw me on Radio Canada, so I guess other media covered it as well. And obviously this is all good, but as someone pointed out on Twitter, the chance of getting the CBC to mention a disruption when it's about the tar sands or climate versus the NATO proxy war or Haiti or some other foreign policy, more traditional foreign policy issue, is almost certainly much lower. The Breach published a story titled "Canada Funneled Arms to Saudis During Yemen War Via Opaque US Program." And it basically details a whole bunch more Canadian light armored vehicle sales to the Saudis through a different program than is kind of the one that got most of the attention, where it's confirmed that the Saudis were using these vehicles in Yemen, and so it just adds to, and Canadian officials were aware of this. There's a tweet from Anthony Fenton mentioning how the Canadian, or the Bahrain's ambassador to Canada, who's based in Washington, that he was in Ottawa and meeting with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute at their offices. And the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, also one of their people, published a thing on their site titled, quote, "The New Saudi Arabia, as an opportunity for Canada. And it explains, despite apparent challenges, Canada should see Riyadh's attempt to reframe their foreign policy as an opportunity for strategic partnership in the Middle East. So basically saying we got to deepen relations with Saudi Arabia, which is an interesting position considering the repression and the very reactionary nature of the Saudi regime. But the Rinal Laurie Institute is a fascinating. I think there needs to be a whole lot more kind of attention devoted to this think tank, which clearly seems to be able to bring officials from other countries into their orbit. And they're all about foreign influence in Canada, which they mean primarily China, secondarily Russia. But they, of course, seem to have a lot of ties to different foreign governments, and they receive a fair bit of money from foreign governments. I'm not sure if they're receiving money from the Bahrain 200 plus year monarchy, or for that matter, the Saudi monarchy. But we know they have received in recent years significant money from Taiwan, Latvia, and some other countries, US government. So that's an issue to follow. And I think the Rinal Laurie Institute was one of the, they published back when the light armored vehicle sale, the big one, became controversial. They published a series of op-eds supporting General Dynamics' sale of light armored vehicles to the Saudis. And it was pointed out at the time that they received, that they were tied in with funding from some of those arms from General Dynamics and other arms firms. In the Globe and Mail, the Joe Juneau, who's a prominent Ottawa-based foreign policy analyst. He used to work for Department of National Defense. Now I think he's with the University of Ottawa. Very establishment kind of figure, pro-military guy. He has a piece titled "Canada Must Rethink Its Friendship with Israel." Published the main op-ed in the Globe a few days ago. And in the op-ed, he says, quote, the Netanyahu government, which includes Jewish supremacists. Now, in reaction to this, Norman Levine, who has a fairly significant Twitter following, responded saying, quote, the term Jewish supremacists borders on anti-Semitism. I'm shocked the editors at Globe and Mail allowed an article including that term to be published. But if you actually read the op-ed, he doesn't even actually refer to the government as Jewish supremacist. He refers to includes Jewish supremacists. Now, of course, the whole Israeli state is structurally Jewish supremacist. I mean, and it's been that way since long before Netanyahu, and Netanyahu has openly stated as much repeatedly. There's like 50 different laws that are Jewish supremacist within Israel. It's the basis, central basis of its apartheid. And it's absolutely comical that someone would say, referencing some of the ministers as Jewish supremacists, that was anti-Semitic. B'Tselem, of course, 2 years ago, published their report titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid." Now, while it's comical to say that people would accuse you of anti-Semitism for referring to as Israel as Jewish supremacist, or in this case, just some specific ministers, it's actually pretty common. And I know of an editor at the Breach left-wing outlet who actually basically he said it's white supremacist, Israel's white supremacist. To refer to it as Jewish supremacist is wrong, and it's white supremacist. And there's the kernel of truth in that. Of course, Israel comes out of European colonialism and white supremacy, but at the end of the day, it's Canadian Jew who can go to Israel tomorrow. It's not any old white Canadian that can go to Israel. So the whole structure of the state is about upholding Jewish supremacy. And the fact that we're not allowed to even state that obvious fact reflects how boxed in the discussion is on Israel, on Zionism, and how the worries of Canadian Jewry take precedent over I should say of some Canadian Jews, worries of some Canadian Jews take precedent over stating very obvious facts about that country. Andrew Cohen in the Ottawa Citizen, who's a columnist in the Ottawa Citizen, a sort of like liberal party. He wrote a book about praising Lester Pearson. He's a sort of like liberal imperialist sort of pseudo academic at one of, I think, Carleton, and he's got a call. He's a weekly or so column in the Ottawa Citizen. His uncle was one of the founders of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and somebody who's criticized CJA, right? He's Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, how it's moved away from some of the Canadian Jewish Congress's more democratic forum, a little bit more liberal than CJA, which is more of a conservative party and even harder line kind of organization. He's written critically about that over the years. He has a piece titled, "American Jews are loudly protesting Israel's anti-judiciary law. In Canada, not so much." And he basically points out how there's almost no dissent within the established Jewish organizations in Canada, even though clearly it's sort of ripping Israel apart, and Israel is very divided on this matter. And I think that's correct. I was on the front of the Federation CJA, the Combined Jewish Appeal of Montreal, which is the umbrella organization of the mainstream Zionist Jewish organizations in Montreal. And the top item is Israel at 75, right? So it doesn't matter like how like openly, sort of fascistic, Jewish supremacist the government in Israel is, it's still all about promoting Israel. That's their, central focus of this umbrella organization. And so I think what Cohen is writing is correct, whereas you're seeing dissent. If you look, Thomas Friedman in the New York Times has published a whole series of articles critical. There was an article quoting a bunch of the sort of liberal Zionist groups that Nick Kristof had in the New York Times a week ago about the U.S. should start thinking about cutting off its aid to Israel. There was an ad taken out in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal from these, I forget which one of the organizations, but one of the mainstream liberal Jewish Zionist organizations in the U.S. Calling for, we need to be criticizing, we need to be backing away from this staunch support. So you're seeing some dissent within the U.S., and you're not seeing basically any of it appear in among the official establishment Jewish organizations. And I think there's all kinds of reasons for that. There's a history there. There's a history, the elite sectors of the Jewish community in Canada were significantly more pro-Zionist before Israel's creation than in the US, because Zionism was very much a project of British imperialism, and Canada was, of course, a dominion of the British Empire. So for your standing within the Canadian elite, Jews who were supportive of Zionism, that strengthened their standing versus, maybe putting them offside, whereas in the US, a bit more of a sort of raising questions of dual loyalty, whereas in Canada, Zionism was very much part of the dominant political ideology and ethos at that time. More recently, you see that Canadian Jews are, they've gone to Israel it's like 3-4 times higher rates have been to Israel, higher rates of Israelis and back and forth living in Israel. I recently heard that a well-placed source actually said that 5,000 to 6,000 Canadians live in the West Bank and occupy East Jerusalem. 5,000 to 6,000 apparently are among the 700,000 or so Jewish Israeli settlers contravening international law. There's higher rates of enrollment in Jewish day schools in this country. Jewish day schools are, and to a large extent, sort of training grounds for Zionism. There's lower rates of intermarriage. That also has an impact on how close the community is towards Israel and Zionism. Also, I think Canada actually has, because it's a less Christian country than the US, it actually has historically significantly less anti-Semitism than in the US. And I think that also has an impact on how sort of pro-Zionist some sort of dominant ethos in Canada's Jewish community is. So all of that to be said is that I think is impacting how you're seeing very little dissent, open dissent against the sort of crazies that are in charge in Israel within the dominant Jewish organizations in this country. In Juno's piece in the Globe and Mail, he mentions the Canadian training of Palestinians, of security forces, and he mentions it in a critical light. And this is an issue that it's unbelievable how little attention this issue gets. That Canada's basically been building up a Palestinian security force to oversee Israel's occupation. Now that's, that is what it's doing. It's been clear for 10, 15 years, but now, Israeli officials are just like stating it openly. And Juno raises that in the Globe and Mail. And I look quickly, Operation Proteus continues. That's Canada's training mission, so it continues. I didn't have the chance to look at it in depth, but it continues, and it deserves a whole lot more attention. Linda McQuaig, on the more positive angle, Linda McQuaig published a piece in the Toronto Star titled Canada's feeble response gives green light to West Bank annexation. It's not a very good piece, but getting some critical thing into the Toronto Star and a corporate outlet is a positive. You have a number of Christian churches that have recognized Israel's discrimination. I think I mentioned the Anglican Church a week ago or a couple of weeks ago, but the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, added to it. Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, World Council of Churches in recent weeks have all recognized Israel's apartheid. And that's, of course, small step in the right direction. It's way too slow. It's unbelievable that it would take this long. Even Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have come to that conclusion, but better late than never. There's a story in a media outlet from West Africa talking about how Canada is keen to boost ties with Gabon in many areas, and mainly in the mining sector, for a win-win partnership. The North American country's High Commissioner, Lorraine Anderson, said after a meeting with Gabon's Minister of Mining and Geology. The story pointed out that Canada was interested in investing in mining exploration and skills training. And this just is a further confirmation that much of what Canadian diplomats do across the African continent is enable Canadian mining companies to exploit resources, and they often fund geological surveys. They often fund training programs to train people in the mining sector, and often this was funded by Canadian aid. It's framed as like helping out, but really the objective is to better the position of Canadian mining companies. I'm just doing a story on the feminist mining rhetoric from the Trudeau government. And I noticed, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, International Trade Minister Mary Ng, how she was met with a Canadian company operating in Mexico and was boasting about how they had added women and now they were a great corporate responsibility company, even though this company has actually been implicated in 4 of their workers involved in union activities were killed. And the company's displaced hundreds but is being framed by and is actually the Canadian network on corporate accountability. I forget the exact title. They actually had a report all about this company's, the horrible stuff it's involved in Mexico back in February. And yet you have the trade minister boasting about the meeting with this company and boasting about how good this company is because they've added some women. But I saw the Canadian ambassador to Peru say something similar kind of stuff, a couple tweets about women in mining. And then I went and looked a little bit, and you see that with the Canadian ambassador in Panama, Canadian ambassador in Ecuador, have in recent weeks either participated in Women in Mining, this initiative probably funded by the Canadian government, in their projects, or spoke at some of their events, or just tweeting about sort of feminist mining. And this is really rich, right? Because Canadian mining is completely associated with epidemics of sexual assault and rape next to the mines, right? There's terrible stories, terrible examples of Canadian mining companies, their employees being involved in all kinds of horrific examples of sexual assault. Sometimes very directly as part of a process of displacement. And that the example in Guatemala back, I think 2007, that court case is going through weaving its way through Canadian court about 11 Guatemalan Indigenous women who claimed that they were raped by HUD-BAY, their security forces, as part of basically driving the community out. But there's tons of examples. Barrick Gold's mine in Papua New Guinea, in North Mara mine in Tanzania. Companies finally compensated many of the victims, and then you had that infamous quote from Peter Monk, the head of Barrick Gold, back in 2011 to the Globe and Mail, where he said that gang rape was a cultural habit in Papua New Guinea, as a way to justify the fact that his company, their employees, were engaged in all kinds of despicable activities around the mines. So Canadian mining companies are, totally, this whole question of sexual assault around their mines. But also women are often the primary victims of the pollution, because as caregivers, more of the burden of health impacts fall on their shoulders. So there's a real argument to be made that reining in the abuses of Canadian mining companies is actually a feminist issue. And of course, the Trudeau government has completely failed their promise to rein in, the ombudsperson, that with some teeth. They completely went back on their promise on that front around Canadian mining companies, and they've ignored the proposal, even from their own Liberal MP, a private member's bill, to strengthen the ability of people elsewhere to hold Canadian companies accountable in Canadian courts for their abuses abroad, which is one of the things that I mentioned, the 11 Guatemalan Indigenous women. Their court case through Ontario court, part of why it's taken so long is because they're actually setting precedent in terms of being allowed to even go forward with their case in an Ontario court. So they have to fight all these legal battles just to even be heard. So there's legislation on being proposed to change it to enable this process. So the feminist mining rhetoric of the Trudeau government is really just a cover for them to justify support for these odious mining companies involved in pillaging and destruction abroad. Ben Norton, American, formerly with the Gray Zone, now multipolarist, I think is the website he writes for, prominent leftist on Twitter. He posted a piece about Indonesia, and this article about Indonesia and Indonesia's bid to gain more from their commodities, specifically nickel. And this article talks about how the Canadian government joined this European Union-led World Trade Organization suit against Indonesia for having forced nickel, basically restricted nickel exports to force companies to process more of it internally and to increase the value added domestically within Indonesia. And it's a monstrous success. So it went from like 1.1 billion to almost 20 billion, I believe it was, in a year of internal value added nickel processing because of this restriction on export. I think it's mostly Chinese companies that have set up operations to refine it within Indonesia. So it's huge success, but it's being challenged at the WTO. And the story also mentions, which I had seen in the business press 6 or 8 months ago, that the Indonesian government raised a nickel producers agreement with Canada to have some sort of sort of cartel and OPEC style agreement among nickel producers. Canada, I think, is the 5th or 6th biggest nickel producer in the world, and the Canadian government just rejected that out of hand. And this goes to the fact that the Canadian government has been really hostile to impoverished countries bid to draw greater benefits from their commodities in a whole series of different ways. And I'm not going to get into all of it, but specifically around different producers organizations. And I'm doing a piece based on some of the stuff I wrote in the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy back in 2009, where I point out that they opposed a producers organization around iron, around copper agreement, international bauxite agreement. Canadian government's also been very ambivalent to international coffee agreement, and which collapsed, I believe, in mid 90s. Agreements to increase the price of sugar in the 1980s for producers. So the Canadian government has been very ambivalent or hostile to efforts by countries in the global South to better control their resources, to get better benefits from their resources. And in the case of the nickel agreement that Indonesia raised to Canada, in principle, Canada would benefit, of course, from a more stabilized nickel price or a higher nickel price, because Canada is a major producer of that commodity. But still, it's hostile to that type of arrangement. And it's because Canada is at the center of global capitalism. It's because Canadian mining companies are the global powerhouse. They don't like resource nationalism. They don't like agreements that governments bring together to gain better control and better benefits from their resources, because that ultimately threatens Canadian mining companies, global operations. To give it just a sense of this the unequal exchange within global capitalism, the Ugandan president at the recent Africa-Russia forum, he pointed out, quote, "One facet of neo-colonialism and colonialism was Africa being confined to producing only raw materials, crops like coffee and minerals. I can give you an example. The global business for coffee is worth $460 billion. That is the value of the coffee business in the world. But of those 460 billion, the coffee producing countries of the whole world share only 25 billion. And Africa, only 2.4 billion out of $460 billion, right? So apparently Starbucks alone, their revenue is something like $35 billion, right? So all of the coffee producers are getting 25 billion, a small chunk of that is going to Africa. And then Starbucks is getting something like 35 billion, right? This is what agreements like the international coffee agreement that collapsed a couple of decades ago, this is part of what this was about, stabilizing or undermining. This is how global imperialism works, is that the value added goes to the center. And that's what these agreements like the nickel agreement that Indonesia was putting forward is trying to undercut, is allow the countries that have been, at the bottom of the pecking order to better control their resources, to get more benefits from those resources, which is a completely sensible and morally right thing to do. But the Canadian government is very hostile to that. On Thursday, Romeo Dallaire received this award recognized as a compassionate humanitarian here in Montreal. As the Global News story said, he was honored on Thursday with another award for being an extraordinary Canadian. And this goes to a long, long, long list of awards that Romeo Dallaire has received. Now, Romeo Dallaire is anything but. And he's very much, the character of Romeo Dallaire goes to the heart of Canadian mythology, foreign policy mythology, and just the world upside down. Now, Romeo Dallaire, when it comes to Canadian foreign policy issues, he's backed pretty much all of the worst. Okay, he backed the coup in Haiti in 2004. He backed NATO destruction of Libya. He called for continuing Canadian troops in Afghanistan. He's called for more targeting of Iran, bigger military presence in Iraq, Syria, even the first Iraq, even the 2003 Iraq. He said he opposed the U.S. mission, but he wanted Canada to lead a mission in Iraq. So even ones where got really, they became very controversial still. And I detailed all this. I have a story from 2007 where I detail. I interrupted an event at Concordia with Dallaire and put on by Amnesty, and I kind of detail all. He called for more military spending. His whole background, as Carol Off in her biography of him says, he was a NATO man, right? Before he goes to Rwanda, he was a NATO man. His whole military background, his father and grandfather were Canadian military people. He's upheld by the left, as I point out in this 2017 story. He's upheld by the left as this humanitarian, but he's actually this very militaristic individual. On Rwanda specifically, I'm not going to get into the whole detail of what happened and how he was complicit in the massive crimes that took place, but he was. And the mythology about Dallaire having, trying to stop it is complete, utter nonsense, as I've detailed a number of places. In fact, he enabled Paul Kagame's forces, the RPF, which of course, as even the Globe and Mail has now detailed on the front page multiple times, they were the ones that shot down the plane that killed the Hutu president of Burundi and of Rwanda, that killed most of the Hutu command of the military of Rwanda, that unleashed the mass killings of spring 1994. They are the ones that did it. Not only did they do that unleashed the mass killings, they're the ones who invaded in 1990, that laid the basis of the horrific war. They displaced 1 million people before the mass killings in 94. Of course, there was the ouster of the first-time Hutu government in Burundi in 1993 that led to hundreds of thousands being killed and huge numbers of Hutu being refugees being driven into Rwanda. That's also part of understanding what happened. Dallaire himself, if you go back to how he depicted what happened in 1994, if you go look how he depicted it to Quebec media in 1994, very different from how he depicts what happened today, right? He's just been part of this whole mythologizing of what happened to basically enable Kagame, who is this bulwark of Washington, London, Ottawa power in East Africa, into this wild distortion of what the Rwanda genocide has been now depicted on. Basically, we're supposed to believe that the Hutus had a long-planned genocide. This is a story. It was a long-planned genocide. Not that it was just a total breakdown of social order that led to mass ethnic killing. That happened. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and there was, ethnic targeting. There's no doubt about that. But the idea was a long planned genocide. We're supposed to believe that the Hutus who did this, they waited until they're the weakest. They'd been in 3 decades since the independence in 1959, 1961 social revolution. And of course, Tutsi and Hutu, what the distinction is, it's basically a caste distinction. Tutsis were the monarchs, and they were the cattle owning elite, and the Hutus were the workers. They were 90% of society. They were the workers. They were the lower order. And basically, the revolt against Belgian colonial rule had a Hutu, had an anti-colonial, anti-caste dynamic to it. And the Hutus took, ousted the Belgians and the Tutsi monarchy, which fled to Uganda, and that's what the RPF is. The RPF is the monarchy who had fled to Uganda, the Tutsi monarchy that fled to Uganda decades later, invading to reestablish their what they would frame as their rightful dominance within Rwanda. But anyways, the idea is that the Hutus waited till they were the weakest in 3 decades to administer their long planned desire to mass extermination. It's nonsense. It makes no sense on its surface. The story makes no sense on the surface. And if you look at the details, as again on the front page of the Globe and Mail, the rockets, the light arm, or not the light army, the RPGs that were used to blow up the plane that killed Habyarimana, the president, and unleashes the mass killing. That was the RPF that got those from the Ugandan military, who of course is who sponsored the invasion into Rwanda. So, notwithstanding this incredible mythology within Canada about Dallaire, every element of the Dallaire story is absurd. He is a militarist. He's a NATO guy. He is a liar when it comes to what happened in Rwanda, who enabled the reactionary forces that instigated the mass killing. But in Canadian mythology, he is the symbol of the benevolent Canadian in the international sphere. And that benevolent Canadian mythology is right at the heart of things like the responsibility to protect doctrine, which has been used to oust the government in Haiti in 2004, used to destroy Libya in 2011. Dallaire was part of the whole will to intervene initiative at Concordia, which was taking the responsibility to protect doctrine further. So the Dallaire mythology within Canadian political life is we need to intervene even more internationally. It's this liberal interventionist mythology that he is, a part of, and even though when it's even well detailed, many different forums, I've detailed many elements of the Dallaire stuff. Numerous different authors on the Rwanda issue have detailed all this out elaborately. It just continues because it serves Canadian foreign policy propaganda objectives. So the Journal de Montréal had a 2-page spread a couple of days ago, all about how the Chinese are infiltrating Canada, and the McGill prof, who's part of this Hong Kong group, who really, really hates Beijing, is quoted extensively, as are a bunch of other Canadian officials who are Canadian figures who really, really hate Beijing, and Beijing is responsible for all of the bad things going on in Canada. And lo and behold, the Globe and Mail published a story, a poll saying that, quote, only 14% of Canadians said they had a favorable view of China, while 79% said they had the opposite. Only 5 years ago, less than half, 45% of respondents said they felt unfavorably towards Beijing. So this propaganda of, China interfering, China's bad, China's interfering, China's Uyghurs, they're genociding the Uyghurs, they're destroying Hong Kong's independence, they are horrible to the people of Tibet. All of this, of course, is making its way into the minds of Canadians. It's serving its function, and Canadians increasingly view China negatively, unsurprisingly. A couple days ago, Trudeau published a tweet and video saying on the 70th anniversary of the armistice of the Korean War, he said, "Today we honor the brave Canadians who fought in the Korean War and defended the values of peace, freedom, and democracy. Their service and sacrifice continue to be remembered in Korea, on the Kaepyeong Trail, and in Canada. We are forever grateful." Now, of course, his depiction of the Korean War has nothing at all to do with peace, freedom, and democracy. We were backing up a ruthless pro-fascist dictator, Syngman Rhee, who was responsible for a terrible massacre against the Jeju uprising, left tens and tens of thousands of anti-fascists, mostly killed after the Japanese fascists occupied Korea. And Rhee, of course, would have fallen except for US Canadian military intervention. But here we are 70 years later, continuing to depict the Korean War as a great struggle for democracy and peace, freedom. Of course, it was more about what happened in China in 1949 and containing the communist nationalist revolution in China. And also it was largely about pump priming the Canadian-US economy with the military Keynesianism. That was what the Korean War was in large part about. Also, it was used to justify, incredibly, stationing Canadian troops in Western Europe, because the story was that it was the communists, the Moscow, that was behind the North Koreans moving south and trying to unite the island. It wasn't at all. In fact, Stalin had been very resistant to efforts by the North Koreans to unite the island, and or the peninsula, should I say? And but it's portrayed. So, but it basically it was used to justify stationing Canadian troops, NATO, in Western Europe, because it was supposedly the first salvo of the communists, the Moscow's attempt to run over all of Western Europe. And so we ended up actually stationing troops in Western Europe for 42 years. Over 100,000 Canadian troops, NATO stationed in France and Germany, initially because of the Korean War. Somewhat incredibly, but that's the history. So it was used to really militarize and give NATO life. The Korean War was. There's a real push for more Canadian military spending, as the Alaska senator criticized Canadian military spending, and that was published in a whole bunch of Canadian media outlets. National Post had a front page, Journal de Montréal, Toronto Sun, and there was an interesting report, I think somewhat positive, in the scope of how our Canadian foreign policy works, military policy. David Puglisi in the Ottawa Citizen reported that Anita Anand was removed as defense minister in part because she was pushing for significant increase in Canadian military spending as part of the defense policy update. And apparently the Prime Minister's office is rewriting the defense policy update to downplay the increase in military spending, to lessen the increase in military spending. So in the scope of things, that's a small little victory, I guess. It speaks to the fact that polling, while Canadians will tell pollsters that they think the Canadian military is underfunded, because they hear that repeatedly from the media, it's underfunded. Whenever you ask public about their priorities, the military is almost always at the bottom. Similarly, they will say they have a high regard for the military, but if you ask where they want public spending to be put, the military is almost always at the bottom. So they prioritize education, they prioritize healthcare, daycare, whatever. their political concerns or the economy, the environment, whatever, the military is almost always at the bottom. And I think that's what Anand being turfed speaks to. There's a good piece, interesting piece in the Maple published yesterday, a couple days ago, long piece titled "Soldiers Aren't Victims and They Deserve Contempt." I'm not 100% sure about the title. The title doesn't actually really reflect the story. One of the most interesting parts of the story, it breaks down the whole question of defunding the military versus defunding the police. And it points out that there's more than 3,000 mentions of defunding or abolishing the Canadian military. When you search Canadian news stream database, there's 40 mentions of defunding or abolishing the military in that same database. So the political movements calling for defunding the military have had way more significant movements had way more success in forcing the media to at least mention the issue. And even though the Canadian military, it has way more resources than the Canadian police, it's more than twice, as the story points out, of spending. And the Canadian military is way worse institution than the police. Its social destruction is way greater. The calls for defunding or abolishing are way fewer. That's interesting, and a whole bunch of other elements in the story that are worth taking a look at. So on the NATO question, and there's a story. I'm taking too long here, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. There's a story. Peace Quest published a story titled "Did NATO Sell Out Canada's Effort to Stop Illicit Weapon Deals with Turkey?" And of course, they did, as clearly as part of Turkey acceding to Sweden's joining NATO. One of the things that was done quietly was that countries like Canada that had brought in some restrictions on arms exports to the Turks, that they've quietly are being removed. The Globe and Mail had a front page story about a base being set up in the Polish town, it appears, of Resov. I mispronounced that. And basically the mayor of that city, where much of the equipment going into Ukraine is, the NATO equipment going to Ukraine seems to be going through, says that there's a plan for a new NATO base there, which is close to the border with Ukraine, and that he's quoted as saying, "American, British, and Canadian troops will be permanently stationed here." The Globe story seems to have Canadian officials kind of denying that there will be Canadian troops will be permanently stationed there. There do appear to be some Canadian troops there, and they are clearly helping bring equipment through there, weaponry through there. But they're denying the more maximalist claims of the city's mayor. There's a story published, I think, Canadian Press story about a camp, a Ukrainian Canadian group camp in Quebec in Saint-Sophie that apparently was covered with graffiti saying Russia and Wagner, in reference to the Wagner Russian mercenary group. And the Ukrainian Canadian Congress referred to this as part of the rising tide of hate against Ukrainian Canadians. And I actually do agree with the UCC on this one. I think going to a Ukrainian camp and writing Russia, that is a form of hate, and Wagner, I totally out of place thing to do. I would hold back on the UCC's more kind of sensationalist pushing on this, and they're clearly trying to use this to shut down events that challenge the NATO proxy war. But nonetheless, I do think this is a legitimate instance of hate, or something, some variation of hate, if you want to call it that exactly. Use that word. There's a Wall Street Journal story titled "Ukraine's Stalled Offensive Puts Biden in Uneasy Political Position." And it shows that, it's another example, there's many of these now circulating in the corporate media, that basically the counteroffensive is failing. The Americans and others are realizing they're going to have to just keep pumping in endless amounts of weaponry and training and other assistance to be able to, keep the Ukrainian military's ability to keep fighting. And they realize this is probably not, sustainable long term, and that they're, increasing questions about this. the story ends with Chrystia Freeland being quoted, where she's speaking at the Aspen Security Forum. And Freeland the story ends with her saying, quote, "My biggest fear for Ukraine actually is us." And so basically Freeland is starting to worry about NATO's resolve, that we're not going to be able to keep doing this forever. And of course, well, what that means is that Ukraine won't be able to keep resisting Russia's war fighting. And I think that's the likely scenario. And I think that probably what's going to happen is, a quarter, third, whatever it is exactly, of Ukraine will not be part of Ukraine, and Russia is going to take that land. And that's just where it is. Ukraine, I think it's becoming increasingly clear, has been used by NATO. It's been successful. It's weakened Russia. It's been a proxy war that's had its success, and they probably want it to continue, and Ukrainians to keep dying, to continue this incredible horrors that we're seeing. But that's probably where it's going to go. And with time, the US and others are going to they're going to sell Ukraine out. They never really plan to go all in, of course. And Ukrainians do the dying, and Russians do the dying, and NATO is stronger, and Finland and Sweden are part of NATO, and Germany is more subservient to Washington, and so is France and other countries, and US power in Western Europe has grown. And so, well, that's Ukrainians have served their purpose for NATO and for Washington and Ottawa, for that matter. And I think Chrystia Freeland probably is a bit torn on a personal level, but at the end of the day, she's more of a NATO militarist than she is a Ukrainian nationalist, and she will align with NATO, even if that probably hurts her from a Ukrainian nationalist perspective to lose a quarter or a third of the country. But that's probably where things are going. Now, there was another interesting development reporting in Puglisi's story about Anita Anand being removed as defense minister. What the story points out, and this is something we kind of knew already, it was fairly clear, which is that the Canadian military opposed leading up a UN mission to Haiti, or a mission to Haiti, presumably under UN umbrella, and that the head of the chief of the defense staff, Wayne Ear, just before Joe Biden was coming to Ottawa, continue pushing Canada on the question of leading the NATO mission, or Haiti mission, should I say, that Joe Biden, that the head of the chief of defense staff came out publicly, went to Reuters, obviously all planned, to tell Reuters that Canadian military didn't have the power, didn't have the personnel to lead a mission to Haiti. And apparently Biden publicly said, "Oh, that's fine, that's whatever." But privately, the Americans are really angry with the head of the Canadian military, and that Anand was taking the position the head of the Canadian military, and the Prime Minister's office was angry because the Prime Minister's office was willing to still hear the American pressure on the Haiti mission, but the head of the military very much sabotaged that. And now, on the surface of this would suggest the Canadian military is not one of the most pro-US institutions in the country. In fact, it, of course, is one of the most pro-US institutions in the country. And what this, I think, more reflects is that the Canadian military, they don't want secondary US empire missions. They want to be part of the big boys, right? They want the glorious missions, the NATO missions, maybe the China missions. They want to be on Russia's border in Latvia. They want to be doing the provocative naval maneuvers in the South China Sea. They want to be part of the central kind of warfighting, or close to warfighting as possible kind of endeavors. They don't want this sort of secondary US imperial endeavor in Haiti. And they have the institutional power to push back. And I think that's what we see. They did push back on Haiti. And it's kind of interesting that Anand seems to have gotten turf from the position, partly because she aligned with the military, over the PMO and maybe Washington on this issue. And this goes to one of the tensions within the Canadian military, historic tensions. And it really, Rick Hillier really reflected this in the mid-2000s with Afghanistan. There's real tension, historic tension within the Canadian military over NATO versus UN peacekeeping. The Canadian military has always been a NATO military, but peacekeeping for a long time was part of what justified military spending. The public liked the peacekeeping element, and they could, if you look at Congo in 1960 or Haiti in 2004, or even Suez crisis in 56, Canadian peacekeeping was very much tied to US global domination. The Congo mission very clearly in assassination of Lumumba, Aristide in 2004. Suez in 56 was actually a large part about divisions, papering over divisions within NATO between Washington and Britain. I can get into that more if people want. But the UN peacekeeping was really something that was totally tied to Washington. And the Korea War, of course, was a UN mission as well, 1950 war, and that was US-led UN mission. So the distinction between US and UN is always a little bit unclear, certainly historically, and a little bit less so today, but still today. But the Canadian military really wants the more serious kind of missions. And Rick Hillier, in that infamous comment there in, I think, 2005 regarding Afghanistan, where he says, we are not just any body, the Canadian military, we are a killing institution and we go to kill the bad guys. That famous quote that got a lot of attention. That goes to this sort of tension within the Canadian military, and even tension within Canadian US imperialism around what the military is for, right? The military wants these hard, the manly, war-fighting missions. Well, imperialism doesn't necessarily function exactly like that. Sometimes they want a military that does, a less high-profile mission to, subjugate the population in Haiti or the Congo, and so there's this tension within the force that I think is somewhat interesting, and I think that's what we see reflected in the military being opposed to leading the mission in Haiti. They want to prioritize other more kind of glorious NATO or warfighting kind of endeavors. I think I'll leave it at that. And if people have questions, comments, go ahead. I'm not sure if Laura is on the session. I don't think she is. So, but I can see a couple hands raised. Go ahead, Nadia. I think I have unmuted you.
Hello.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Hello, Yves, thank you for the presentation, but there were so many subjects put together. How can I remember all this? I wanted to ask you, has our CBC, has it become a mouthpiece for the government? Under Catherine Tate.
I think that the CBC, as I pointed out in the Propaganda System book, has always been a mouthpiece of Canadian foreign policy. Early on, was very explicit in that, and had very close relations with the Canadian military and all kinds of different operations. They provided media for Canadian military outposts and the like over the years. So yeah, the Canadian military has always been very close to the Canadian military, to Canadian foreign policy apparatus. There's degrees of independence, and that can be based upon various factors. How much activism there is out there. That can be based upon some individual characters within the CBC structure. That can be based upon if you set up more think tanks that have coming from a left wing or a challenging perspective, that gives CBC people cover to cover. They need to have credible voices saying these uncredible ideas. So there's all kinds of factors that play into that. But if you look at the history of the CBC, it's one of being very, very integrated with the Canadian foreign policy, Canadian military apparatus, establishment, outlook, and there's many different factors in that. I'll just give one little quick example before I move on to Alan. There's a story. It was Canadian military, I think it's the Canadian military official historian, one of the official historians, published, I think, in a National Post 3, 4, 5 years ago. I quoted it in the Stand on Guard for Whom, A People's History of Canadian Military. And I think I might have written about it in some story online, where he talks about as the World War I veterans, maybe it's like the 50th anniversary of the end of World War I, I think it's like in the 1960s or 50s, 60s, they interview like dozens and dozens, like 50, 100 of World War I veterans, sort of as I guess, as you know, they're getting into their 70s or sort of towards the, not many of them still alive. And they're apparently, there's just like bunch of them, many of them, who talk about how when German soldiers surrendered, they still killed them. And apparently the Canadians were like particularly bad in killing German soldiers who had surrendered. And so a bunch of them tell the CBC they got like 50 hours of radio recordings or something, like 300 hours, huge amount of recordings. Apparently this theme comes up fairly regular. None of it makes it into the 12-part series that then appears on CBC, or 6-part or 12. It's like a long series, like hours and hours that appear on the radio. None of it makes it. But the official historian, I guess he went back and he listened to the whole recordings or whatever, and that's just one example. So even like decades and decades after World War I, they wouldn't, like, even in their own voices of these veterans, they wouldn't have this sort of damning stories about Canadians killing Germans who had surrendered, because it would go against whatever Canadian kind of mythology around global affairs. Go ahead, Alan. I think you need to, you still need to unmute here. I think I've unmuted you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yes. I just wanted to make a comment about the Korean War or that conflict. And I had seen sometime back on the, found on the internet, a story that was told about what happened there. The Americans carpet bombed just as bad as Japan during this, at the end of the Second World War, where those 2 atomic bombs were virtually unneeded because Japan was totally flattened. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not even per se military targets. The military targets had been totally destroyed already. And the claim also is that the bombing of Korea was even worse than when the Americans were in Vietnam, and they destroyed not just military targets, but dams and all kinds of infrastructure that were needed for people. And this is regarded by the United Nations. These are regarded as war crimes. The other comment I'd like to make is I just yesterday finished watching, perhaps many people have heard of this, it's 3 hours and 27 minutes. It's called Everything is a Rich Man's Trick, from JFK to 9/11. And that really tells a story of American Nazis. The number one being George H.W. Bush, who played a role in disposing of JFK. That's just, and in there's a picture that is painted of that these imperialist wars like especially on the part of the Americans, is to get something going and have it working just like a smoldering fire. You keep it going on forever, just as what was done in Afghanistan, and a similar scenario appears to me to be developing in Ukraine. You keep it smoldering, just keep putting enough in there just to keep it kind of moving. And of course, the arms companies are just as happy as pig, and you know what? I come from the farm, so thank you.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the military-industrial complex, which funds a huge number of the think tanks and different ideas kind of formulators in Washington, and the same dynamic in Canada on a lesser extent, that they need wars, they benefit, they're always putting forward ideas for more belligerence. There's no doubt about that. And you're completely correct with regards to Korea. It's 3 or 4 million people killed. They stopped bombing North Korea when all buildings of more than one story had been destroyed. And there's all kinds of horrific stories of just napalming villages. And there's this one that appears in the New York Times that just the whole village is just basically wiped out. And Lester Pearson is complaining that the censors didn't suppress the story and it made it into the New York Times. So yeah, it was a horrible war beyond belief, and Canada was right at the center of it. They not only did they kill North Koreans, which mostly but they, and Chinese, of course, who fought, hundreds of thousands were killed. But they, even South Korean allies, they often raped and killed South Korean allies, and little happened. Very racist, tons of instances of extreme racism. And 70 years later, you have Justin Trudeau saying it was all about freedom, democracy, and peace. So yeah.
One thing I forgot to mention, if I may, is that included in that info that I found in the internet was that the Americans had just ran out of places to bomb, so they would just take and dump their bombs out in the ocean. Furthermore, they actually did a couple of dry runs with dummy atomic weaponry. Years ago, many years ago, I worked with a fellow that was American and had been in Korea, and he referred to the Koreans as gooks.
Yeah, tons of racism, tons of instances of that. So I don't see any other comment. I don't know, hands up. It's after.
Carly has her hand up.
Who does?
Carly.
I'm not seeing this. Let me see if I can find Carly from a different way. Oh, I see it. Go ahead. Is that working, Carly? Are you unmuted? No. Let's see. How do I do this?
Yeah. I'm unmuted now, I guess. According to your mindset and prejudice, wouldn't you make a case that the Russians are doing a great service for the military-industrial complex, and they should be praised for the fact of being able to encourage this huge deployment of arms and implements and the countries against the assault and illegal incursions into the Ukraine. And I also mentioned too that, I mean, among the huge number of malicious actions that the Russians have done since they have begun their invasion, they have extensively deported tens of thousands of children to Russia. And these children have been adopted or assigned by Russian foster families, despite even the fact that they have relatives still in the Ukraine. And they're not making any connections. They're not trying to return them. They're not trying to, what they're doing is repatriating them, turning them into Russians, much as they did in in the Crimea to infest the area with Russian populations in order to manufacture a vote that was illegal and unconscionable. And I also like to connect them too with the actions of Serbia and the justification for NATO to bomb Serbia after the brutal way that they have, swept through Croatia and Bosnia Herzegovina and massacred thousands upon thousands of people, and are still in Kosovo and still just stirring up the groundswell and illegally doing that. Russia was behind Serbia. They trained Serbia, they armed Serbia, and they directed Serbia to act in the way. And you look a little, what would you call it? As in the headlights of contra opinion. I think the sooner NATO gets a full force and pushes Russia back to the border and pushes them into a box that they can't get out of, the better the world will be.
Well, I have stated many times that I do believe Russia is a militaristic country. I think Russia has, I think that the one way to understand this is that the US and NATO are very militaristic countries, but Russia is also a disproportionately militaristic country, and their response to what NATO has done partly reflects the militarism of Russia. And so I sort of agree with that. And clearly what Russia's done has been a real boon to the North American military industrial complex. So I agree with that. I don't agree with agree with a whole bunch of the other stuff you're saying. I've on many occasions said that I think Russia's war is contrary to international law and brutal. But I do think it was very much provoked, and I think it's very much being prolonged by NATO, and with Canada right at the center of that. I think your depiction of Yugoslavia is kind of unbelievable for someone living in, I presume you're living in Canada, to depict it in that way, because Canada was right at the heart of trying to destroy the multi-ethnic Yugoslavia, and then that all culminated with the bombing of Serbia, and that's the idea that Russia was responsible is all pretty hard to take too seriously. But yeah, so I mean, there were some other parts of what you said that I don't agree with the Crimea depiction. I think Crimea, the population of Crimea mostly wants to be part of Russia, and there's lots of polling that showed that from many years, even before 2014, and continues to show that today. The question of Ukrainian children, I think, is something that's that's a particularly one-sided depiction of what's going on. That's not to say that the Russians haven't. There are not instances of Ukrainian children being taken to Russia that are questionable, but this idea that this is sort of genocidal and stuff like that is really, I think, overblown. But yeah, so and now I got a few more hands up. We are at 7:13, so I do want to try to keep this not too much longer, but go ahead, Julio.
Yeah, how you doing, Ibs? Very quickly, how do you see what's going on in Mali, where Niger, where the French are being booted out? How do you see that those incidents affecting what's going on with the proxy war?
I don't know. I think that would be the simple answer. I think that there's a real exaggeration of this is all about Russia and this kind of stuff, and the French and the US have, they need justifications for their military presence, for their, domination, and now saying that Russia's about to move in and Russia this, Russia that, helps to justify that. So I think that that's being exaggerated. On the surface of it, the military stepping in and ousting someone who's elected is a bad thing. Not always, but that's a pretty basic one for me. That's a pretty strong generalities. I know there are framings of what's going on as sort of, counter to French US power. I really don't know enough to say one way or another with a confidence, but generally the military getting involved in politics is something that I'm very opposed or ambivalent towards. But I don't know. I was thinking of looking at Canada's role historically in Niger and sort of doing some dives, some significant Canadian mining operations there, of course. And yeah, so, but I don't know.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you, Yves.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I would just like to see back to the USSR, like the Beatles said. It's true. And in NATO, totally disagree with guy who's before. And let's get rid of Texas. Texas is a lot of trouble. Let's get rid of it. Done.
Just that made me just think of one final thing. I meant to point out when the previous comment, the critical comment around the justification for Canadian US policy. I think it's totally crazy to call for NATO to get directly militarily involved in a large scale and to, as the wording exactly was, like put Russia into the box. That is not going to make the world better. That is going to make the world disappear, or at least the ability for humans, or many humans, probably particularly people in Western Europe, like that's just. This is not, you're not thinking through what you're saying if you're saying that. You are basically calling for the chance of nuclear Armageddon to be really high. And that's not, unfortunately, at the end of the day, we'd be like, oh, well, at least we were right. That's not going to do us any good. That's just going to lead to incredible levels of death and destruction. So, and the people running the U.S. empire understand that they're not so crazy. They're clearly willing to roll the dice way further than they should be, but they're not so crazy as to get right to that point, because they understand that that's just that's just not, it's not good for capitalism. It's not even good. It's not good for the military industrial complex if it's all kaput, right? Like, so at some point the more presumably the more sort of sane will take control on this stuff. But do you have another comment, Nadia? I'm
just on the gentleman who spoke about Russia. What people don't understand is that half of the people in Ukraine are Russian speaking, or they're married to Russians, and they're intermarried. It's not like and what Zelensky did is he banned the Russian language completely from some areas where there was a majority. It's like, telling Quebec, oh, you can't speak French anymore. It's exactly it's exactly like that. So I think that people demonize. I'm not saying that Russia is an angel by any stretch of the imagination, but neither is NATO. And you spoke very well when you said giving NATO more powers means Armageddon, means the end of the world. It's exactly what it is. And I want to go back to my original question when I asked whether the CBC had become a mouthpiece for the government, that when the government is allied to the media, and they're one and the same, speaking in one voice, that's fascism. That is the definition of fascism, totalitarianism, is when both the media, which is supposed to be investigating the truth, becomes the mouthpiece of the government. That is no longer a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I think it would be totally, I don't think we have a functioning democracy when it comes to domestic issues. I think if you look at how the media structure, the academic structure, the think tank structure, on and on and on, obviously wealth and powerful institutions have so much influence over what gets known and gets told, and et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to foreign policy, there's very, very limited room for debate and discussion. And I wouldn't necessarily call that fascism. I think that the reality is that the CBC and the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, and journalists are in some sense relatively free to report on and cover what they want to cover. In another sense, they aren't hardly at all, but in one sense they are. And in the sense of the fact they're going to find themselves in jail for doing it is very unlikely. And that's something more akin to fascism. They have for their own career reasons, they have self-censored. They have for their own, they actually believe what they're writing. There's a whole internalizing of, they believe Canadian myth. I mean, I tell this story about Sue Montgomery at the Montreal Gazette in the propaganda system book. And Sue Montgomery in the Montreal Gazette, just before the coup in 2004, she gets sent down. She's a sort of like lefty-ish reporter at the Gazette, and she gets sent down to Haiti, and she is just like becomes a mouthpiece of the Canadian government in her reporting, and gets completely played by the Canadian government and the embassy and justifying the coup. And she later realizes she gets played, right? And she goes 180-degree turn. And she basically 2 years later in the election, she writes a column where she says that Pierre Pettigrew and Denis Paradis, who are the two, and Denis Coderre, who were two liberal MPs right at the center of Canadian policy in Haiti, they should lose their seats for what they've done in Haiti. And so I talked to Sue Montgomery about this, and she's interviewed in a master's thesis about media reporting on the coup. Very good thesis. Totally forgetting the title of it, but I talked to her about it, and she basically, one of the things she tells me and why she covered the way she covered is that she couldn't believe. She couldn't believe that Canada would be doing that. It just didn't fit with what she understood as Canada in the world. She just so she herself believes the mythology, of course, of Canada being this benevolent force. So the idea that the Canadian embassy was like directing her to odious human rights groups that they were funding to justify a coup, or that the Canadian embassy was, enabling these rebels that were killing people to destabilize an elected government, popular government. She just couldn't believe all this. This was all being done in the service of the most narrow sliver of Haitian society, and she just couldn't believe what actually happened. And it took a lot of pressure, and that's what we did. Haiti Action Montreal, we pressed her. I publicly criticized her, somebody who I'd known her beforehand, and others, and there was a whole push, and it was kind of a complicated story, but she, and that goes to a lot of the journalists. So some of them are just totally cynical. They know what their boss wants to hear. A lot of them just believe the dominant ethos. They believe what's in the media. That's one of the fascinating things about corporate media, and I've seen it in all kinds of different ways. There's a pack element to it. If you get into the corporate media, you're more likely to get corporate media attention, because the media covers what's also been in the media, right? So if it's been in Le Devoir, then Radio-Canada is willing to report on it, and they're willing to have you on to talk about it. And so it's a whole fascinating dynamic of how they are self-referential. If you're outside of that, then you're uncredible. You're not a anyway. So there's many facets to it, but yes, no doubt the CBC is very much what we've seen in the past 18 months on the NATO proxy war. The CBC's one-sidedness is something extreme and is, I think, a bit unique in what I've seen over the past 2 decades plus of doing this, following this stuff. But I'm not seeing any more hands, and we're quite a bit past 7 o'clock. So, I actually I see actually Lynn and John. I'm going to go with John because I know Lynn's already spoken, and I'm sure her hands are still up just because of mistake. Go ahead, John, real quickly.
I just want to caution everybody not to throw the fascist word around so easily. There are fascists in the world, but the role of institutional media in any state is to support the structures of the state, whether that was Pravda in the Soviet Union, the Globe and Mail in Canada, or Fox News. That's just the way it is. That doesn't make CBC or Canada fascist. That just means that as a media consumer, you have to pay attention. Too often on these calls, I hear people leap to these extreme accusations and throw mud. And I really appreciate, Eve, the way you bring a more nuanced view to these things. So thank you.
Lynn, do you have a final comment or question?
Yep. I just want to say we should give Texas to Russia. And then we get rid of Greg Abbott, no problem. But you know what? I don't think Russia would accept it. Done.
On that note, thank you, everyone. Good night. See ya.
Bye.
Same place, same time.